Sounds great. Well, welcome to today's webinar titled Mistake Proofing, Real-World Examples Across Industries. I am Linda Vicaro. I'm the Director of Solutions Engineering and also the head of KaiNexus's Lean Council here at KaiNexus. And I'm very happy to be serving as host for today's webinar and joined by Mark Graban as our presenter.
Thanks for hosting, Linda.
No problem. And so with that, I will just briefly introduce Mark. Our presenter, Mark Graban, is a senior advisor for KaiNexus. Mark has helped organizations improve for almost 30 years, working in manufacturing, healthcare, and software startup settings. He is an author, speaker, and consultant. His latest book, The Mistakes That Make Us: Cultivating a Culture of Learning and Innovation, was just named a recipient of the Shingo Publication Award. Congratulations, Mark.
Thank you.
Mark is also the author of the award-winning book Lean Hospitals, something that's been on my bookshelf for quite a long time, and others, including Measures of Success, React Less, Lead Better, Improve More. Mark earned a BS in Industrial Engineering from Northwestern University, along with an MS in Mechanical Engineering and an MBA from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and specifically from their Leaders for Global Operations program. So at this point, I will turn it over to you, Mark, and I will be prepared to jump in with some examples as we go along. Also, I'm really looking forward to this.
All right. Well, thank you, Linda, for collaborating on this, and look forward to your commentary and examples. And yeah, feel free to jump in at any point. We want to share, as the title suggested, a lot of examples of mistake proofing in, from workplaces of different types, and maybe mistake proofing that we might interact with in the world around us, things we might take for granted. The best mistake proofing is often kind of subtle, and it just works, and we don't notice or appreciate it. So I want to share different examples today. But first, I want to give a little bit of grounding in, background in the Toyota production system, or Lean, and set the stage for the different examples. Pictured here is, the LEI version of something people might be familiar with, different forms of it, the TPS quote unquote house. And I always like to, try to emphasize that Lean is not just about efficiency. It's not just about speed. Going back to Toyota, we talk about the two columns, the two pillars are related to not just in time, where we think of continuous flow and pull systems and small batches and producing to customer tact time and all of that. But there is the kind of intertwined, and I would say equally important, column related to quality. The word Jidoka refers to being able to, stop and notify associates or team leaders or others about abnormalities. That might be done by pulling an andon cord in a manual way. It might also be done in an automated way. And if you go to Toyota's own corporate TPS website, as they describe Jidoka, it's the highlighting or the visualization of problems, that we're building in quality. And so part of that is, if there's a malfunction or a defect, we want the machine to catch it and automatically stop, so that we don't produce more, and that operators or associates or team members don't have to hover over each machine, constantly supervising it to watch for problems. We can build in that intelligent automation or automation, or automation with the human touch, as it's often described as. And arguably the first instance of Jidoka within Toyota happened decades before they started making cars, or a decade. Pictured here, this is from one of the Toyota museums in Japan, a weaving loom. This was Toyota's original business, machines that would automate turning thread into cloth. This innovation, that it was called the Type G weaving loom, was initially a mechanical detector that would detect when a thread broke. right? So it didn't prevent the breaking of the thread, but what it did was it mitigated the risk of creating defective cloth. And so pictured here, you can see kind of like a vertical ripple. And I'm trying to point to it with that red arrow. If the machine did not stop automatically, it would be producing defective cloth, right? So at least it's stopping the process at a point where it's not creating too much waste. And you could think of more modern versions of this that might use electromechanical sensors, might have a light go off, flashing lights like you might have with the manual and on-cord pull. This Jidoka process is both reducing the risk of defective cloth not being caught and being shipped to a customer. It also led to huge productivity improvements because now you could separate and not need one operator per machine. There's dual benefits around quality and productivity. We can redeploy people to growth and more interesting jobs. So this was a part of Toyota's early innovation. Creating these patents and selling these patents helped fund the auto business. This is a screen capture from one of the videos that they show at the Toyota Museum, kind of talking about early principles and spread of this from the Toyota family as leaders, the idea that, we want to stop automatically if anything irregular occurs, don't produce defects. And again, like don't make people watch over machines constantly, which I think we could argue is a respect for people example. Like it's not really making the greatest use of human potential and intelligence to just stand there watching a machine. So if we can't, better than just detecting the problem and stopping the machine might be preventing a problem to begin with. So the Japanese phrase for this, Poka-Yoke, it would really be translated to mean, let's say, mistake proofing. And they have a couple of Poka-Yoke examples on display in the museum that you can interact with. And so I took a video where, let's say you've got a question of like, which parts am I going to reach into a bin and grab for this next product that's being presented in front of me to work on? This mistake proofs it where you insert a card related to the product, and you can see that card with the pink and blue. When I inserted that and pushed forward, it opened the pink and blue bins. And then there was a separate card, not in the video, that would open a different combination of colored bins. So maybe not the most elegant way of accomplishing that, but it was, it's a way, relatively simple. Now here's actually the second example of a card that opened, those look like springs, for blue and green. So reducing, if not eliminating, the risk of grabbing the wrong item to be put into the product. And as Toyota describes, a Poka-Yoke device, or I'm going to say mistake proofing, is any mechanism that either prevents a mistake from being made or makes the mistake obvious at a glance. Now, I've mentioned some of this terminology, whether we say Poka-Yoke or English translations or translations into other languages. I think the terminology matters, and it leads into the mindsets related to lean and TPS and mistake proofing. There's a lot of stories documented in different ways, including books about Shingo, that they originally used an expression Poka-Yoke, which a friend of mine says translates quite directly to mean idiot proofing. That yoke is proofing, baka means idiot. We don't want to say things like idiot proofing or fool proofing or dummy proofing. I've heard those examples and maybe more. That I think is disrespectful and it's insulting and it misses the point that the problem is not the worker, the problem is the process. And there's old stories, probably true, about somebody getting upset with Shigeo Shingo. You called me a fool. I'm not a fool. And he took that to heart and adopted Poka-Yoke instead of Baka-Yoke, which can translate to mean mistake proofing or error proofing. Some of you might have attended John Grout's webinar about a year ago on mistake proofing. And I agree with John that we could say mistake and error are synonyms. I'm not going to argue about whether you call it error proofing or mistake proofing, but please don't call it things like fool proofing, because we want to engage people. We want to protect them from being involved in mistakes, but we can also engage them in figuring out how to mistake proof the process. As Shigeo Shingo said in one of his books, defects will never be reduced if the workers involved do not modify operating methods when defects occur. And I don't think anyone is pinning that directly or exclusively on the workers, but it's that team leaders and group leaders and managers and others should be collaborating with workers. It's in everybody's interest to help prevent mistakes and help prevent human error. Here's another video of a device from the Toyota Museum that came from employee input. I think the possible mistake here would be grabbing the wrong number of bolts. And for this job, you're supposed to grab 4 bolts. And as John Grout points out, the best mistake proofing also makes work easier. So you can see this little device automates pulling up 4 bolts, and then it stops. And then they go into the chute that I could push up with my hand, and I've got 4. Now you think of the job cycle, I would be going and installing those bolts, and the machine's running. Like, I'm not going to have to wait for those bolts. I just reach my hand under, pop it up. There's another 4 bolts. In this case, the same 4 bolts for every product. But again, this comes down to systems, and we can look at more modern day Toyota leaders. Gary Convis says it really well. You respect people, you listen to them, you work together, you don't blame them. Maybe the process was not set up well, so it was easy to make a mistake. Like, this is part of leaders' obligation. And a doctor from the UK, Sir Liam Donaldson, who's involved with the World Health Alliance. He was the World Health Alliance, the WHO Alliance for Patient Safety, was also, I believe, the chief medical officer for the England NHS, said it the same thing in a little bit different way, is that human error is inevitable. We can never eliminate it. We can eliminate problems in the system that make it more likely to happen. And said another way by a friend of mine who worked for Toyota in the US a long time, Daryl Wilburn, it's the responsibility of leaders to provide a system in which people can be successful. And again, I would argue that's a matter of collaboration. It's servant leadership and employee engagement, kind of all working together. So before I move ahead into some examples, Linda, is there anything you would want to add from your reflections on learning this and applying it in other workplaces?
I was actually just thinking about the importance of calling out here that it's about respect. And I know that was visible in the definitions on the previous slide, but it's respectful for us to make sure that it's difficult to make mistakes. It's respectful of people's time and their, just the value of the time that they have to not have to spend their time counting out screws or, picking the right things out of a bin or doing things that not only are mistake prone, but also just time consuming. So I think those two things go hand in hand.
Yeah, exactly. So in lieu of more effective mistake proofing, we often see a lot of signs in workplaces related to equipment or processes. I would argue that signs are a symptom, or signs show us where we have an opportunity to try to apply more effective mistake proofing. Signs and warnings are probably the weakest form of error prevention. So I've got a couple of pictures, unfortunately, that I've collected from hospitals that I've visited over time. One is a piece of pharmacy equipment that dispenses pills. And you see this kind of dire warning: risk of injury, do not reach inside until motion stops. Like, well, that should be mistake proofed. The equipment maker could design something that can't open until the machine has been stopped, or a machine that stops automatically when you open it. And I think that's partly on the manufacturer, and it's partly on the people buying this equipment to demand better and not just rely on telling people to be careful. I have a second example. This is a piece of pharmacy robotics that picks pills in little bags and puts them into bins. And you see lots of dire warnings here. Caution, do not operate without guards in place. I'm like, well, why is that not mistake proofed? Warning, this machine starts automatically. Why does it apparently have a mind of its own? A lot of factories would have lockout, tagout procedures for equipment like this. They wouldn't rely on a big caution sign that says, before inserting the rack and starting the robot, make certain there are no people inside. Like, yeah, that's good advice. But that can, and I would argue, really must be mistake proofed. If it's not built into the equipment, is there a way of retrofitting it? It's much more common in manufacturing and other settings to have machine interlocks. Here's an example here where if you open a door or move a guarding, it cuts power to the machine. And that would be, to me, a much better example of mistake proofing and would help prove the point that mistake proofing is more effective when we make it more difficult or impossible for a mistake or a safety issue to even occur. That's part of the challenge and the obligation. Now, in less life or death situations, we might see around us on the left picture I took a long time ago at Quiznos. I haven't been now. Company's been in decline. I'm not going to say it's because of a lack of mistake proofing, but in their trash bins, like they were very adamant about don't throw away our precious baskets that your sandwich had been sitting in. And I think, well, it's kind of a lost opportunity. Instead of scolding us about throwing away their baskets, maybe they could have said, thank you, please come again. In-N-Out, a restaurant that I've been able to go to much more frequently and has done better than Quiznos did, they've mistake-proofed that same situation. You can see like literally the trash hole is smaller than the red plastic tray. They don't have to threaten us or scold us or plead with us. It's like literally impossible to do that. So I think that's a good example of everyday mistake proofing. When I think of, kind of a hierarchy of types of mistake proofing, kind of starting at the bottom, going from worst to better or best, we have warnings, mitigation efforts, detection efforts, and prevention efforts. And I want to share a few examples that you might see in everyday life. Local grocery store in the Texas area. Warnings are fine. This one just kind of makes me chuckle. Grilled salmon, warning, contains fish. Like, okay, good to know. It also says that it's low gluten. I guess I would be more surprised if fish had gluten, but if it had breadcrumbs or something on there, that might be worth warning about. Warning, salmon contains fish. I bet peanut butter also contains peanuts, or it had better. So again, be warned, but that wouldn't prevent somebody who, I guess, had no idea that salmon was a type of fish. Okay, enough about that. A little piece of mitigation that I take advantage of a lot because I'm clumsy is the MacBook MagSafe adapter. And if you haven't had the opportunity to use one of these, I think it's way better than a USB-C because if you trip over the cord, which I have done, it has enough magnetic pressure, magnetic force against the laptop where instead of the laptop being dragged onto the floor, the cord pops out of the side of the laptop. And I say, oh, thank you, Apple, for saving me from the cost of a repair. There was a generation of MacBook Pros where they, for some reason, got rid of the MagSafe adapter. And I learned the USB-C adapter will sometimes pop out. And I never had a laptop go on the floor, but I certainly had some close calls and near misses. So again, if the mistake is tripping over the cord, if the bad impact is broken laptop, I would say this is at least a mitigation type of mistake proofing. Error detection. We run across this on web forms a lot of the time if you're using KaiNexus or other applications. Creating a free account. Like, okay, good job in realizing that mark@kainexus.com is not a valid email address. I forgot the period. So they've detected that. They've at least prevented me from submitting that into the system. But then, I don't know, sometimes these forms start squawking at you and lighting up red when like all he did was type the first letter. Like, of course it's not a valid email address yet, but that's more annoying than it is impactful. But now we think of different examples of prevention. Hotel room Keurig single cup coffee makers have made what might be a surprising piece of mistake proofing built in. So pictured here, this is ready to go, but you notice I haven't put a cup underneath. And so there's a green light. Now, to me, the green indicates good to go. I'm surprised it's not red or a flashing red that says, hey, you haven't placed a cup here. I'm not going to brew. And so that sensor, it adds costs. Like this single cup coffee maker is about $200 compared to a very simple one you might buy at home that doesn't have this sensor for maybe $30 or $40. I imagine the hotels have decided it's better to spend that money than it is to have people brewing coffee and spilling on the floor and having the cost of removing a stain or what have you. So there is the risk that somebody puts the cup on there upside down, which I've done with my home Keurig coffee maker, right? So it's kind of preventing one type of problem without preventing others. I had a mess on the countertop in my kitchen one morning because, again, the mug was on upside down. Whoops. Here I'm going to show a quick video. This is a clever invention from a company, SawStop. Just let this play. Imagine that hot dog was your finger or your thumb. Like this has been very intentionally designed to detect not a piece of wood, but the hot dog. I have no idea how it works. I have no idea how it detects that it's not the thing that you are looking to cut, but it's smart and it prevents injury. I'm going to play this video. This is, I just love this guy's accent rather than me narrating it.
Here's a clever device from Sweden. It's an automatic candle snuffer, spring-loaded. And the spring will make the cap flip over like that. Well, not at that speed, actually. When it's on a candle, it takes some time. So if you place it on a candle that hasn't yet been lit, and you can say, I want the candle to snuff out, that's halfway there. Or some people don't put it at the bottom where there's a wreath, perhaps, to stop the wreath from catching fire. And if you now light the candle, perhaps in about 2 hours' time, that thing will automatically snuff itself out. That's a bit long to wait. So the other one's been burning for some time, but even that will take a bit of time to do. So if we cheat slightly by pushing this one up a bit, you'll see the snuffing action. Here we go. Pop!
Pop! He loves that. I love his accent, the way he says fire. But this prevents the mistake of falling asleep while a candle is burning and setting your room or your house on fire. That's a very clever, simple invention. And sometimes the best mistake proofing is not super expensive. It's more clever. That lean principle of using your creativity before capital could apply. Let's think about gas stations. We see a lot of examples of mistake proofing there, some that you might recognize and some that you might not notice. I haven't think I've ever seen a sign on a gas pump that says caution, don't forget to return nozzle to pump before you drive off. I've never done this. I tempt fate every time I use this example. Here's a picture an old friend of mine shared with me on Facebook of their teenage driver made that mistake and ended up driving off with the gas pump. So this causes some damage and there's some cost to the gas station, but they've mitigated the risk of a fuel spill or a fire or an explosion because the fuel pump doesn't assume people are going to be perfect. It assumes that people are going to drive off and they have a breakaway valve built in. There was a New York Times news story years ago that said that this happens at the average gas station once per week, not across the country once a week, at your typical gas station once per week. If they didn't have that mitigation mistake proofing in place, you might really damage or destroy the gas pump in a way that would be far more costly or potentially dangerous. There is mistake proofing. For example, for one, if you're fueling, most cars will shut off automatically because there's a valve. that lets you know that the fuel tank is full because you can't see that. You can't really tell. It shuts off automatically to prevent the mistake of trying to put too much gas in and having a spill. There's also mistake proofing that prevents you from putting diesel fuel into an unleaded car because the nozzle is too big to fit. Now, this is not error-proofed in the opposite direction. You can put unleaded gas into a diesel engine. In a weird twist, that's actually more damaging to the engine to put unleaded into a diesel, but there's a long history involving the bigger nozzles used to be for leaded gas, and this wasn't really designed as an optimal system up front, but at least it does prevent you from putting diesel into unleaded. If your company has a mixed fleet of vehicles, I guarantee you a driver is going to make that mistake. So maybe it's better to have all diesel or all electric or whatever it is, all the same. To me, usually the green pump suggests diesel, but we have to be careful. There are some gas stations where the green nozzle is regular. So we can't just rely on that be careful or color coding gets hospitals in trouble sometimes when the wristbands for patient security alerts are not the same at different hospitals in town. Some hospitals have gotten tripped up over that. There's good mistake proofing about credit cards. So with the old swipe credit card, you dip the card, you pull it out, you put the card back into your wallet. With the chip cards, you have to leave it in there a little bit. And there might be a reminder that says, please remove card. But better yet, most of these are actually mistake proof where it will not dispense fuel until you do remove the chip card. So that's a nice example of mistake proofing. And I know, Linda, this made you think of a different example that's similar.
Yeah, it made me think of the ATM where I would probably lose my card all the time if it didn't require that I take my cash first.
Yeah.
As it is, I feel like when I go to the gas station and I, tap my card or whatever, stick it in my pocket, go about my business, fill the tank, then I can never find the card afterwards, but at least it's in my pocket.
Yeah. And then the other example of a warning, there are a few things maybe that are difficult to mistake proof or have not been error proof, like turning off cell phones and risk of static. They say don't slide into your car and slide back out, especially if you have cloth seats. That would be, I guess we've decided that's not worth mistake proofing. The warning about turn off your engine, like that could be mistake proof, thinking back to machine guarding interlocks where the fuel door doesn't open unless the engine's off.
Mm-hmm.
That would add some cost, and maybe regulators haven't deemed that necessary. Turn off engine, and then apparently it's a big enough problem when, the second handwritten sign, please turn off engine, please do that.
I feel like some of these warning examples also contribute to the like the lack of attention to warnings. I don't know how many people are turning off their cell phones when they're pumping gas. My guess is zero.
Probably zero.
So to see that warning suggests to you that these warnings don't really matter.
Yep, if they're not heated. So speaking of gases, different gases, Linda, if you want to talk a little bit about what we typically see in hospital about medical gases.
Yeah, I think this is a pretty common example. It's definitely something that I've used in, similar trainings to this in the past, which is that hospitals have, a whole panel of different medical gas outlets in one place. And so in order to avoid connecting the wrong thing to the wrong place, there's a couple of different strategies at play here. One is that these lines are color coded, as you can see. So your first inclination is going to be to put it in the right place. But then even if you do make a mistake, the actual connections themselves won't plug in to the wrong, port or whatever the right word is there. Somebody actually mentioned in the chat to us that this is a good example to use or like a good habit for the gas pump, that if the diesel pump itself was a square connection, then you wouldn't have the issue of putting it into the wrong gas tank and vice versa. And it seems like they've done that, to your point, in one direction, but not in the other.
Yeah. And people can see how these notches for medical vacuum, oxygen, it's offset, it's different.
Yeah. It's very simple, just a very small change difference, but completely prevents the possibility of making this mistake.
Yeah, and some hospitals have done similar things where it comes to IV lines and food, feeding lines, color coding, and making sure that you don't inject liquid food into someone's bloodstream, for example. Hospitals sometimes use warnings, whether it's wristbands about allergy or do not resuscitate orders, color-coded socks indicating a different like fall risk levels can be a helpful visual. Probably better, deeper mistake proofing would be the use of wristband barcode scanning, where the best practice would be scan the medication, scan the wristband, immediately administer the medication. Now, that does assume that upstream, the right medication, that we didn't put the wrong medication into a repackaged baggie with the barcode that's now inaccurate, right? So we have to make sure the whole value stream of medications is setting people up for success. We want to avoid a situation where nurses might be trying to save time, and I'm not blaming the nurses for this. They're overburdened and situations where people go outside the system and print barcodes that can be scanned at the medication station as a batch. This increases the risk of a mix-up, and we want to make sure people aren't put in a position where they are circumventing mistake proofing.
This goes back to that conversation about the value of people's time, really. If we don't help them find ways to save time while also reducing the risk of error, then people are going to work to save time in whatever way is available to them. So it's better to do it collaboratively.
Yes. Now, scanning medications can help prevent a mix-up. A common mix-up, unfortunately, had been confusing heparin with Hep-Block, as pictured here. The way that medication used to look resulted in a lot of mix-ups. Now, people might say or be judgmental and say, well, one's got a green cap and you should just read the label, and one's got a slightly lighter blue. But then you think of situations, well, what if the cap's been removed? What if it's 2 a.m? What if the room is dark? What if you're fatigued? All those different opportunities for human error pop in. And there were a couple of different incidents at different hospitals where young babies were either died or were harmed because they were given an adult dose instead of the lower dose that would have been appropriate for them. So there was, I think, correct pressure placed on at least the one company producing these medications to change the packaging of the one that was the 10,000 units, that it had a very different form factor. Like you've got brighter coloring, red and black versus the blue. You've got this paper seal that has to be torn off. Like it would be harder to physically mistake one for the other, even if visually they look now much, much more different. So I think a lot of good mistake proofing built in, better late than never. When you think of the risk of needle sticks being a big risk of harm or infection for providers, I like this idea of this auto-retracting needle. So when that syringe, when it's pushed all the medication, the syringe automatically pops back in. And there's a version of it where you have to do that manually. I'm sure the auto-retracting one is more expensive, but when we look at the cost and the impact on human life, to me, that seems like nice mistake proofing. When you think about the risk of wrong side surgeries, I had ChatGPT create this image tongue-in-cheek that if we could just hang a giant sign that says, caution, be careful, don't operate on the wrong side, the wrong site, the wrong patient, surgical errors would be a thing of the past. But we don't do this, and this wouldn't be effective. Within surgical universal protocols, we might do things like, so this is an old colleague of mine, her husband fell and broke one of his collarbones. The one collarbone that was not broken was marked with an NO, and they were kind of laughing about like, well, you should have been able to tell which one looked broken. You can see, here, but they said they actually did mark the surgical site, and there are different versions of the protocol of marking with an X, or the surgeon signs their name on the spot while the patient's still awake. That might hurt if your collarbone's broken, but there are some wrong side surgeries. I've heard of cases of, internal issues of cutting into the wrong side of a patient for a hernia procedure. Might not be as visible for certain types of hernias. Laboratory equipment. I used to work in that space a long time ago. Here is a piece of equipment that has a caution. It says basically, don't insert this asymmetrical rack the wrong way. So this picture here would show the correct way. That picture would be backward, and it would jam up the equipment. And I remember asking one manager the day I took these pictures, well, how often does this happen? And she kind of shook her head and said, yeah, it happens all the time. And my company made that equipment. I'm not going to name names now. But ironically, this is a picture of an older generation of that same equipment, where you can see the angle here. The stat rack literally made it impossible to insert the thing backward. And then the newer generation had a nicer looking, label, but arguably wasn't as mistake proofed. So again, sometimes you need to lean on your equipment vendors to do a better job of building in mistake proofing. Sometimes you can retrofit things. I've seen hospital laboratories that have, sometimes a sign that says, don't bump the knobs on the centrifuge because you change the settings. One hospital I worked with addressed this by just taking a small plastic cover and putting it over the knob. So if you needed to change the speed, which you shouldn't have been doing really that often anyway, flip this up, turn the knob, prevents the problem of somebody bumping it with their hip. I have a friend who worked at a hospital. This is going back at least, I think, 15 years ago. Lots of caution signs in hospitals about, make sure you wash your hands. This guy, Kevin, actually worked with people to create, I think, some clever mistake proofing. Let's watch him explain.
What we have here is a mistake-proof device for hand hygiene, and its purpose is to be a visual and a contact preventative measure of somebody entering the room before they've washed their hands or sanitized their hands using the touchless hand sanitizer. So it's activated by the light sensor underneath the hand sanitizer. So you can sanitize your hand. There's a motion sensor there that won't let the gate go down until it doesn't see anybody in the passageway. And then to exit the room, you follow the same procedure where you wash your hands before exiting and passage through the door. And what we have here is a...
So one other thing they built in, they got pushback from people about, well, what if it's an emergency and I really need to barge through? You could literally walk through the barrier. It wasn't going to stop, really physically stop somebody from entering, but it served a little bit more as a forcing function to ensure a higher compliance to hand washing. A couple other examples, and I'm going to go through some of these quickly. I apologize, I'm having to rush and I'm not giving you a lot of space to jump in, Linda, but I want you to be full part of the Q&A with me. A lot of hospital medication cabinets are designed where the drawer that you need to pull from is the only one that pops up and opens. That's one way of reducing the risk of grabbing the wrong medication. Arguably, we had this in manufacturing a long time ago. I saw this in factories 25 years ago, Dell Computer and other situations where you're having to pull different parts for different computers. They call it a pick-to-light system, where the lights go up and you reach and you grab something from that bin. If you were to reach into the wrong bin, it might buzz and give you an indicator that something was wrong. Here's a slightly different version that has some light projection. Green means grab this one. Red means don't grab that one. That can be, nicely built in. A couple other manufacturing examples when you look at fasteners. Here's an example from a book on Poka-Yoke. Regular slotted screwdriver was slipping and it was scratching the equipment, so they switched to a type of fastener that has a different slot where the screwdriver was less likely to slip. That's better than telling people to be careful. Lots of examples of things that could be inserted upside down or backward. In this example here, they reduced or eliminated that risk by building in a guide pin to the fixture so that the item couldn't be put in there backward. So let's talk about a few examples from everyday life, and then we'll wrap up and do Q&A. Sadly, data shows here, this is 2019, so this is over 30 years. More than 900 children have died in hot cars. As the article says, I didn't need to try to do the math in my head, sadly. 38 kids die on average. And a lot of this is because a child is left in the back seat. A lot of it is because a parent or parents are out of process. They don't normally drive the kid to school. They normally drive to work. They were taking the kid that day. They get distracted. They're on autopilot. They have the human error of driving to work instead of dropping the kid off at school. And they discover a tragic outcome at the end of the day. A lot of vehicles now have some sort of reminder. And I think this is smart where, Linda brought up the point of alarm fatigue or warning fatigue. I've had rental cars where if I open the back door and put my backpack in, and then I get to my destination, I turn the car off, then the warning pops up. Rear seat reminder, look in rear seat. And it's probably a function of the door being opened. I don't know. You could have a weight sensor in the seat that would add more cost. That would help. But I think, just punishing people who make this mistake doesn't really do anything to prevent future harm. We look at situations over the decades where there have been reports of quote unquote unintended acceleration in different cars. The biggest cause is the driver thinking they had their foot on the brake when their foot was actually on the gas. It's human error. It's a physical slip. There are some cars where the brake pedal was closer to the accelerator than in other cars, and that mishap was more likely. A lot of modern cars have built in this interlock where you are required to put your foot on the brake before you shift into reverse or you shift into drive. Now, people could still make the mistake of shifting into drive when they thought they were shifting into reverse, and they drive forward and crash into the front of their garage instead of backing out. But at least that one failure mode has been, in a lot of cases, eliminated. Modern cars with backup cameras, they may rely, so one, they give you better visibility. They may give you a warning, but I think better than that warning that says, please check surroundings for safety, is something that beeps or buzzes or the seat vibrates when a car is starting, to come across in the parking lot, of not just being careful and giving you the tools to see better. That kind of warning is, I would argue, better mistake proofing. I'm surprised. I don't think we yet have vehicles that would automatically brake if you were trying to back out of a parking spot and a car is coming across. But we do have in a lot of cars now automatic braking systems when it detects you're about to rear end somebody, or automatic lane correction that will either alert you that you're drifting out of your lane, or in some cases actually steer you back into your lane. So there's different instances of mistake proofing that you might notice or might take for granted when it comes to vehicles. And then the final example I'm going to share related to Zoom. We're using Zoom webinars, Zoom meetings. I think the two most common things to click are the share button, or maybe at some point you want to leave. In Zoom, on a lot of screens, those are pretty far apart. There's a pretty good gap between the more button and the leave button. I've been tripped up a couple of times in Teams where the share button was very close to the leave button, and I slipped with the mouse and I accidentally left the meeting. Zoom does another thing where if you do intentionally or otherwise click the leave button and you're the host, it pops up and gives you choices. Do you end the meeting for all, or do you just leave the meeting? To me, my eyes are drawn to the red, and I have accidentally clicked on end meeting for all when I was trying to just leave. That was a KaiNexus meeting, and oops, and we'll try not to do that here today with the webinar.
I have to say, in the Google Meet example, I find myself very frequently navigating to a different website accidentally and then leaving the meeting. And I wish there was a pop-up for that.
Yeah.
Where you want to navigate away.
Yeah, let's protect us from human error, which means, forgetting a step. And one other countermeasure, while not perfect, sometimes it's the best you can do, is the use of checklists. So I highly recommend Atul Gawande's book, Dr. Atul Gawande. He's a surgeon and he's a great writer. The Checklist Manifesto talks about examples from aviation, how checklists are being used in operating rooms and different healthcare settings. And Linda and I both took advantage of checklists. I used a checklist we call the before and after checklist, make sure we don't forget steps in setting up the webinar and processing the recording and everything after the fact. Linda and I both used, we call it our day of webinar checklist. And Greg Jacobson and I, Greg, our CEO and co-founder, when he and I used to do the webinars, we made all kinds of mistakes. And every time we did, that became something new to put onto the checklist. If you're disciplined in using the checklist, you can avoid repeating the same mistake, even though you might be bound to create and learn from new ones. So the final thing before Linda will have a few announcements, and I think we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A. These are among the many books out there on mistake proofing. The one on the left, Poka-Yoke, has tons of examples, and I think sometimes it's just helpful to learn from examples, to have a mental catalog of different ways of mistake proofing different things. This book is very manufacturing oriented, but then that helps you be creative when you run across opportunities to mistake proof your own process. Mistake proofing for operators, Make No Mistake by C. Martin Hinckley. There's, of course, the classic Shigeo Shingo book, Zero Quality Control and the Poka-Yoke System. And then a little bit outside of lean land, this is a book that's been one of my favorites for the longest time, Don Norman. This is more about product design, the design of everyday things, where he talks about, forcing functions as a way of making it easier or default to do the right thing as a way of preventing the wrong thing. So I'll point you to those books. And John Grout started a website a long time ago, mistakeproofing.com, as he's got one foot into retirement. He's handed that website over to me to try to improve it and maintain it and keep it going over time. So I'd also invite you to go to mistakeproofing.com. So with that, Linda, I'm going to turn it over to you for a couple of quick announcements.
Well, thank you very much for a great presentation. I hope that while we talk through a couple slides here, you all will jump in and post your questions in the Q&A. I don't think we have anything there just yet, so get those questions in, and we still have a little bit of time to answer them. I would first like to mention that we do have an upcoming webinar. And this webinar is with Shauna Forst, and the topic is what PE teachers and PECS professionals have in common. That will be on March 5th at 1 p.m. Eastern. You can sign up on the KaiNexus website at www.kainexus.com/webinars.
Registration is open if you want to do that right after this webinar.
And if you'll go to the next slide, in addition to this, I would encourage you to check out our blog, blog.kainexus.com. I know that I subscribe to it and I read the blog on a regular basis. It's always thought-provoking. It gets me thinking about things that, I may already know, but I haven't spent any mental time with recently. And so it's just a nice prompt for me to take a little bit of time to think about some of these concepts, think a little bit about how I'm applying it to my own work. And I would encourage you to sign up with this QR code right here or on the website. In addition, we also have a KaiNexus podcast, and you can sign up for that via this QR code on your screen, also available at Apple Podcast, Overcast, Stitcher, and a variety of other apps. You can also find it on our website, kainexus.com/podcasts.
And the recording of this and other webinars go into the podcast feed along with other KaiNexus and continuous improvement content.
Yeah, so you can get caught up on what we've done in the past, as well as catching this webinar there. And finally, let's switch over here to talk a little bit about Q&A. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A section. Mark, one of the questions that I had that came to me as we were looking through the slides here is whether you have any advice on how to maintain mistake proofing, because I'm sure that as our work evolves, sometimes the mistake proofing that we've put in place probably becomes less relevant. So how can we do a little bit of maintenance on that? Do you have any advice?
Yeah, I mean, I think keeping the communication open, about continuous improvement or Kaizen opportunities or problems is something to focus on. Making sure people feel a sense of psychological safety where they know they can speak up and say, let's say, for example, our process has changed and this mistake proofing step had been put in place, and I don't know if it's necessary anymore. Can we eliminate that step? Because again, I think back to John Grout saying the best mistake proofing makes the work easier, not harder. If the mistake proofing is making the work harder, people might then be tempted or pressured into circumventing it. So yeah, I think we want to be open to that feedback. I think of the example of the checklists. Over time, we add fewer things to the checklists. I'm not convinced we've made every mistake that's possible, but we also take things off the checklist because sometimes the technology improves and it's eliminated the risk of making a certain mistake. So yeah, we do sometimes prune it because I think there's another lesson about checklists. If they're too long, if they're too time consuming, that becomes a barrier instead of being something that's just purely helpful.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that it also speaks to the idea, again, I guess this is my subject matter, is respect for people. And
Hmm.
if people are involved in the creation of the mistake proofing that is put in place, then they probably feel like they have more voice in maintaining it over time and calling
Hmm.
attention when it's not working for them anymore. And having that engagement is just going to do nothing but good for the overall work.
Yeah, and just building on your point about involving the people doing the work, I think when somebody has been, and I'm going to say, I say it this way intentionally, when a team member has been involved in a mistake,
Hmm.
that's different than saying the team member made a mistake. When a team member was involved in, or was in a way the victim of an error with systemic causes, instead of punishing that employee, who's better positioned to help come up with ways of preventing a recurrence of that systemic mistake? Like if we,
Hmm.
this is the mindset of saying we set that employee up to fail, we shouldn't punish them for that. We should involve them and they have the motivation to make sure that they or other people aren't victim of that mistake in the future, which then also has benefits to protecting the customer or the patient or whoever. I mean, it's all lined up. Everybody
Yeah.
wins when we prevent mistakes, the customer, the employees, the company, so let's do more of that instead of just reacting by punishing.
Hmm. We do have a question in the Q&A, which
Yeah.
is, does completing a failure mode effect analysis support in identifying errors when reviewing processes?
Yes, I'm glad you asked about that, Scott. And in my book, The Mistakes That Make Us, which is a lot, focuses a lot on learning from mistakes after they've occurred. I do have a chapter in the book about preventing mistakes,
Mhm.
and there's an introduction to FMEA, in that book where, one source of ideas for mistake proofing would be reacting to mistakes, reacting to near misses, but I think there's certainly opportunity to be proactive and think through what could go wrong, what's
Mhm.
the likelihood of it happening, what's the severity of it if it did occur, what's the detectability of the mistake. We absolutely don't have to wait until the mistake is made. So if like we're in a healthcare situation and we've got an organization that has never had a wrong side surgery, or has never given the wrong blood type to a patient in a transfusion. Just because that's never happened doesn't mean we have a perfect process.
Yeah.
And we can analyze and I think as engineers we're taught to think through what could go wrong. That's not being negative. Like I've had some people throw it at me like, oh, you're just being negative. I'm like, well, I mean, no. Well, I think I'm being positive that we can prevent harm. We're being proactive, and I think FMEA is a good tool for being proactive.
Absolutely. There's some conversation in the chat about warnings, and I think that it's something that I've thought about, which is the difference between a warning that a mistake is going to occur and
Mhm.
a warning that is really just legalese. I have to tell you this in
Yeah.
order to make sure that you've been told. And I think that's a really interesting thought as well, and probably speaks to the importance of having a distinction between which of our warnings are things that you're legally required to know, I'm legally required to tell you, and
Yeah.
you know, if there's truly a warning that I'm trying to use in order to prevent you from some error in the moment, maybe that needs to come across in a different way.
Right. And sometimes those warnings, I mean, sometimes there's not like I don't know how you would error proof, let's say a bottle of household chemicals, bleach or something that says do not drink. I don't know how else, I don't know how, that's an education.
Mr. Yuck sticker.
Or maybe yeah, Mr. Yuck sticker, or you mistake proof it by making it harder for a child to open the cap.
Right.
Right. So maybe but sometimes people leave the cap off or the kid learns how to open the cap. I think it was Michigan State University Law School used to do a funny product warning labels contest every year. And I'm a drummer. So I remember once, I don't know if I submitted it to the contest. I bought a pair of drumsticks that came in a plastic sleeve. And on the plastic sleeve were warnings, if I remember right, that included things like do not use drumstick if broken and keep drumsticks away from eyes. And you probably, especially a broken drumstick, you should keep away from your eyes. But I'm just wondering, oh my gosh, like don't make jokes about us drummers being dumb, please. Because I mean, especially back to, and I know I said earlier, please don't say things like dummy proofing or idiot proofing or fool proofing. And, so I don't mean to take that too lightly. That's just meant to be a self-deprecating drummer comment.
Well, it looks like we are about at the end of our time. Do you mind if I share my favorite mistake proofing that has generally allows me to get everywhere I need to be and back?
Yeah, please do.
Which is that my Prius has an alarm every time I leave the keys behind in the car, which I do almost every time. It alarms and then it unlocks the doors for me. And so I am able to grab those keys and be able to get back into the car the next time. So
Yeah. You didn't put up a sticker that says, hey, don't forget to take your keys.
I have not had to do that. So far, the mistake proofing there is very effective.
I'm glad that one has saved you.
Well, I would like to thank you for being here, Mark, and also everybody who has joined us. On behalf of the entire team at KaiNexus, I am Linda Vicaro, and we will see you Kai next time.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks everyone for being here.